Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in AP English, and we turn now in our study of the Odyssey to book 14, The Loyal Swineherd. This is one of the more interesting books of the Odyssey, and I would say of all of Homer, Iliad and Odyssey combined. Probably one of the most misunderstood often books of the Odyssey. The question is obviously, what's going on with especially Odysseus' really long lie story? He actually has two of them. One's much longer than the other. We'll try and answer some of this together. So all I'm going to do is to challenge you to keep an open mind as we begin our conversation of Odyssey Book 14. I mean, we can summarize it very quickly here in a second, but when you read it, it seems like it takes forever. Many of my students saying, what is going on with this long story and why? We'll have maybe something to say about it. Now let's do a real quick summary of where we have been. Again, if you haven't been following my stuff on learnstrong.net, you want to find that AP folder and then go in and take a look at the previous lectures we've already given, 1 through 13. First of all, let's play this game really quickly and just summarize what we've seen. The first 4 books, again, are about Telemachus. In the first book, we have the invocation of the Muse, and of course, we have Telemachus' mission. That is to say, it's time to grow up, Athena tells him through Metis. Time to grow up at line 340. Telemachus in book 2 calls his assembly. He's mocked. There's the attempt then to leave, and he does so to try and get information. He's with Athena in the form of mentor. In book 3, we have Telemachus at Pylos talking with Nestor, and off he goes with Pisistratus, Nestor's boy. In book 4, we have Telemachus in the castle of Menelaus and Helen, and Telemachus does get information that, yeah, your dad was reported to be alive. At the conclusion of book 4, which is the end of the Telemachus, we have the suitors waiting to kill Telemachus, and we have Penelope, who is obviously worried about her boy because he's gone off. In book 5, 6, 7, and 8, we have that Odysseus leaving Calypso's island and finding his way to the island of the Phaeacians. Book 5, on Calypso's island, leaves. Poseidon tries to kill him. He ends up on the island of the Phaeacians. In book 6, we have that famous exchange with Alcinous' daughter Nausicaa, the princess, and then she gives him information about how to go about getting help. In book 7, we are in the court of the Phaeacians. It's like Eden. It's like El Dorado. It's like this perfect place, right? And Odysseus goes in as supplicant, and he eats and he sleeps. In book 8, we have the famous Phaeacian games. Demodocus, the great poet, will tell wonderful stories. And Odysseus is asked by Alcinous, who are you? Books 9, 10, 11, and 12 are the famous flashback books, yes? Those are the ones where we get the story of where Odysseus has been. In book 9, we have the sack of the Lycaonia city. We have the Lotus Eaters. We have Polyphemus. The Poseidon's curse will be called down on Odysseus for blinding Polyphemus. In book 10, we have Aeolus, the king of the winds, and the Laestrygonians, who will destroy all of Odysseus' men and ship except for the one ship that he is in, and he ends up on the island of Circe for a year. In book 11, Circe tells him you have to go down to the underworld, to the house of the dead, and you have to talk with a number of people, especially Tiresias. Down there he sees Tiresias, he sees his mother who is now dead, Agamemnon is there, Achilles is there, ends with Hercules. In book 12, he comes back from the land of the dead. They bury the body of Elpenor, this warrior of theirs that has fallen off the house before they left. They go past the island of the Sirens. Odysseus gets to hear the song of the Sirens. They go past Scylla and Charybdis, or rather I should say through it, and end up on the island of the sun god Helios, where they've been warned, don't eat the cattle. Well, Eurylochus does convince them to eat the cattle. They do it, and for that they are all punished except for Odysseus. Odysseus ends up on the island of Calypso. At the conclusion of book 12, the Phaeacians are blown away, and at the beginning of book 13, they say, it's time for you to go home. They return him to Ithaca. The Phaeacians are, in fact, jacked for helping in Xenia. They help Odysseus return home. Poseidon's mad, so he turns their boat into stone, sinks it to the bottom of the ocean. And then Odysseus has this interesting exchange with Athena. He has this long story lie that he tells. I've often pointed out to my students, think about this. For 7 years, he was on the island with Calypso. For 7 years, all he did was have her to talk to. And every time that we saw him in book 5, he wasn't talking to her very much. He was sitting out on a rock looking towards Ithaca. In other words, he spent a lot of time alone for 7 years in solitary confinement, you might say, along obviously with being with Calypso, a drop-dead gorgeous goddess, right? But when he finally gets out, he wants to talk. So it's not shocking. Let's put this in our notes. It's not shocking that he loves to tell stories and talk. And so that's exactly what he will do for a number of these conversations that he has with people. We're going to see this in this book as well. Finally, Athena will transform Odysseus into an old man so that when he arrives at the little hut of Eumaeus, there's no way that Eumaeus, the swineherd, the guy who takes care of the pigs, no way he'll ever know that he's talking to the king of Ithaca. Now, just to remind, the hope is that you're reading this material on your own and then using me as a help. You probably will be asking the question, what's up with these long stories, lies of Odysseus? And I'll do my best to try and help with that. Reminding you, our learning theory is the capacity to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. I hope that you will continue to do that in our study, in our annotative study. We answer the 3 guiding questions. What does the text say? Summary. What does the text mean? Level 2A themes, messages. Level 2B, the rhetorical level of reading. Again, we're focusing on symbolism and irony, and we'll have much to say about that here. Finally, at level 3, we ask, how can I relate in some way to this information? And at 3A, we will begin with relating it to the Iliad, because we've had our study of the Iliad closely. And then finally at 3B, how can I relate this to myself? Before we get to the brief summary of Book 14, consider what I've already said. Odysseus is a great talker, but it makes some sense that he's a great talker because he's been so alone for so long. So when he finally gets with somebody, he wants to tell stories. In this book, we're going to find something really fascinating about Odysseus. When we, later in our time together in AP English, when we encounter Alfred Lord Tennyson's great poem, Ulysses, the Latinate form of Odysseus, we will find there an old man who is ready to go on a final journey. And Odysseus is defined by Tennyson as an individual who loves journeys. I cannot rest from travels, I will drink life to the lees, he will say. Come, my friends, 'tis not too late to seek a newer world. Push off and sitting well in order. Smite the sounding furrows for my purpose holds. To sail beyond the sunset, the baths of all the western stars until I die. But in the Odyssey itself, Odysseus is no lover of journeys. As a matter of fact, the only thing he wants to do is just get home. And you get a sense that when he finally gets home, his last journey will be the one Tiresias told him he has to take with an oar over his shoulder so that he can make some kind of supplication to Poseidon, bury an oar somewhere far inland, and then come back home to live at peace the rest of his life. There is no sense whatsoever in the Odyssey that Odysseus actually loves journeys. And yet, when we think about Odysseus, we define him as this lover of journeys. Why is that the case? The answer is Book 14. Why? Because in Book 14, Odysseus tells a story, as the old man disguised, of a man who loves journeys. Okay? So I'm already giving you one good reason to look at Book 14. I hope maybe a little bit differently. All right? So let's go ahead now, briefly summarize Book 14, and then we'll look at a few lines as we like to do. First, we have Odysseus with Eumaeus in the first meeting. The dogs, who are the guard dogs, attack him, and without Eumaeus there, Odysseus would have been probably attacked and mauled by the dogs. Eumaeus, this poor old man, shows Xenia, that guest-host relationship that we said defines everything about the Odyssey. He is immediately going to let Odysseus know that he is really sad that his master and king Odysseus is no longer there and is in fact, he believes, probably dead. He feeds Odysseus a couple of pigs. He offers Odysseus a drink. Odysseus then, as the poor beggar, right, will say, I think Odysseus is coming home. In fact, I'm pretty sure of it. Then Odysseus will tell this long story to validate why he believes Odysseus is coming back. We're going to spend a long time taking a look at this long story or the lie of who he is. He says, we are told at line 407, 408, he's a man who knows the world. Now, of course, Odysseus does know the world, but in the story, he's an amazing traveler. He comes back from the city of Troy, for example, after defeating the Trojans, and he's there at home 1 month, and then he says, I had to get back on the road again. I had to go sailing, and I went down to Egypt, and I had this amazing experience there, and then I ended up in another place with some Phoenician, and then I ultimately ended up blah, 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 blah. In other words, he's got this amazing story where all of these adventures, some of them will reference some of the adventures that he actually tells in the other story. I think there's another thing going on here. We consciously know that he's lying to Eumaeus. Okay, we consciously know this. And then a little bit later he's going to have another lied story that he tells. But it makes us reconsider the stories that he's been telling to the Phaeacians, those flashback accounts, and to ask, how much of that is accurate, legit, versus made up, contrived. I think there's reasons for us to consider that as well, right? Eumaeus, he doesn't buy the story about Odysseus coming home. He's a skeptic, just like Odysseus was the skeptic when he met Calypso, just like Odysseus was a skeptic when he met Athena, just in the last book. They eat together again. This time they kill a best hog because other herdsmen come in, and now they're all together. And then it's time to go to bed. Odysseus doesn't have a cloak, though. Athena didn't leave him with a cloak. She just left him with a real paltry garment. And so he wants a cloak. To get the cloak, he tells another story. This time he tells a story about being at the walls of Troy, and the amazingly ingenious Odysseus, get the irony here, Odysseus telling a story about himself. The amazing ingenious Odysseus helps the blind, the poor beggar, not blind, but poor beggar, to be able to get a cloak. It's kind of an ingenious little story. And Eumaeus gets the point when Odysseus asks, can I have a cloak? Eumaeus will get him a cloak, lays him down by the fire. But the book will end with the swineherder saying, I don't sleep indoors. I sleep outside. I protect my master's pigs. It's an amazing thing that in this text, we have something that kind of mirrors what we saw in the Iliad, when Briseis is really upset that Patroclus is dead, right? She's been returned from Agamemnon. And she will talk about how much she cared for Patroclus, because when she was taken away, and her brothers were killed and her father was killed, etc., etc., when she was taken away by Achilles, Patroclus told her, you will be able to marry Achilles and become his wife. Don't be upset. And she bought it. In other words, someone who should be really angry at Achilles apparently is not at all. It's a bizarre idea that Achilles can do all these terrible things to her family and she's still going to be okay. In other words, she's been subjugated and yet she somehow is totally at peace with it. People in power positions would like to think that their underlings are always happy and pleased to be in those positions, love to serve them in some way. In the Iliad, it's Briseis with Achilles. In the Odyssey, interestingly, it's Eumaeus. This, ostensibly, he's a slave, servant, but he loves Odysseus, his king. Also, he's taking care of Odysseus's pigs, in spite of the fact that he thinks Odysseus is, in fact, dead. He continues to do his job, even with Odysseus gone and absent. Okay? Which I think makes him kind of a remarkable character in his own right. All right, let's turn to some of the lines, as I say every time when I'm with you guys, right, and I'm studying these lines with you. I'm like, dude, I wish I could just read it all for you, but, I can't. But we'll go to work with some of it. In the very beginning, we're told, Odysseus will climb a rugged path through timber. We've been told several times that Ithaca is a very rugged place, great for raising sons, in fact, we're told. He goes to find Eumaeus, because he's been told by Athena, that's where you need to go. And sure enough, when he gets even close, he says, we're told that, that Eumaeus is this amazing keeper of the pigs. It will remind us of Robinson Crusoe later when we meet Robinson Crusoe, who's been stranded on an island for years, and he's got this really detailed system to keep everything in place. Eumaeus will remind us of this. We're told that by now at line 25, they were down to 360 head of pigs because the suitors are constantly eating them. Dogs, like they're eating them all the time. In other words, note the irony, the pigs, the suitors, are eating lots and lots of pigs, and we're starting to run out of pigs. We're also told that there's dogs there, and these dogs will immediately come at Odysseus. And the very first thing that Eumaeus will say to Odysseus at line 40 is, "Lucky to be alive, old man. A moment more, my pack would have torn you limb from limb. Then you'd have covered me with shame, as if the gods had never given me blows and groans of plenty," sounding very much like Odysseus usually. Oh, I've had a terrible life. We're going to hear this a lot from Eumaeus as well. "Here I sit, my heart aching, broken for him, my master, my great king." Now, the irony, of course, is obvious at 2b, right? So you've got Eumaeus saying, "I'm always sad because my king Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, is not here." But notice here it says, "broken for him, my master, my great king." He doesn't say his name. Continuing that mantra idea that the name of Odysseus is a very interesting name. "Fattening up his own hogs for other men to eat, while he's starving for food, I wager, wanders the earth, a beggar, adrift in stranger cities, foreign-speaking lands, if he's still alive, that is, still sees the rising sun." In other words, he says, I don't know where my master is, maybe is some beggar somewhere. And of course the irony is, yeah, he is the beggar that's standing right in front of you. "Come, follow me into my place, old man, so you at least can eat your fill of bread and wine." Even though he's really poor, he will show proper zenea, which obviously sets up that notion of what the suitors will not show Odysseus when he arrives in their court later, right? "Then you could tell me where you're from and all the pains you've weathered." The idea is that in zenea, you feed your guests, sometimes bathe your guest if you can, and then you ask where he is and where he's from and who he is. Odysseus has this royal welcome at line 60. And he says, "My host, may Zeus and the other gods give you your heart's desire for the royal welcome you have shown me here." And then we've got this interesting construction. Put it in your notes at 2b. We will see this at line 64. We see it several times in this book. "And you," replied Eumaeus, loyal swineherd. And then he has some things to say. This "you" we saw several times in the Iliad, where it was almost like the poet who's reciting his poem has Menelaus right in front of them, and he says, "And you, Menelaus." The intimacy of this poem will remind us, of course, of Whitman's Leaves of Grass, where Whitman himself, learning it from this poem, will do the same thing, where he'll kind of almost reach out to the reader and say "you," or to somebody else and say "you." Here it's going to be Eumaeus. The idea is that long after this poem has been constructed and it is being told by the poet bard, it's going to be Eumaeus who's sitting there, and it's like, "Hey, do you remember when Odysseus showed up as the old man, and you didn't know he was the old man, and yet you treated him with kindness and a royal welcome," if we can say it that way. He says this about, Eumaeus says this about what's going on. "We servants, always cowered by high and mighty masters, especially our young lords. But my old king, the gods, they must have blocked his journey home. He'd have treated me well. He would, with a house, a plot of land, a wife you'd gladly prize. Goods that a kind lord will give a household hand who labors for him hard, whose work the gods have sped, just as they sped the work I labor at all day. My master, I tell you, would have repaid me well if he'd grown old right here. But now, he's dead." And then an interesting line. "If only Helen and all her kind had died out too, brought to her knees, just as she cut the legs from under troops of men." It's fascinating how it's constantly back to Helen as the reason for the fall of Troy. Now, it's significant that we've met Helen already earlier, right, in our poem, when Telemachus is there at the court with Menelaus and Helen. We're going to see Helen for the last time in our next book, so we're going to save some comments about her until then. But it's always fascinating. He continues, Eumaeus, "My king among them, he went off to the stallion land of Troy to fight the Trojans, save Agamemnon's honor." And then he says it. Enough, right? I've had enough with that one. He kills a couple of pigs. He feeds Odysseus. He says, "Eat up. Now, my friend," at line 93, "it's all we slaves have got, scrawny pork, while the suitors eat the fattened hogs. No fear of the gods in their hard hearts. No mercy. Trust me, the blessed gods have no love for crime. They honor justice, honor the decent acts of men." This idea of justice we'll come back to when we do our Plato's Republic in Book 1 and the question of what is justice. Notice here, though, what the poet is doing, and we'll see this over and over again in this book especially, when Eumaeus will talk about the idea that these suitors deserve to be jacked. They do not have any respect, setting us up for book 22, when in fact Odysseus will in fact jack all of them, right? But the suitors know. They've caught some, we're told at line 103, they've caught some God-sent rumor of master's grisly death. That's why they have no mind to do their courting fairly, to go back home in peace. No, at their royal ease they devour all his goods. Those brazen rascals never spare a scrap. Not a day or a night goes by sent down by Zeus, but they butcher victims, never stopping at one or two, and drain his wine as if there's no tomorrow, swilling the last drop. Believe me, my master's wealth was vast. And then we get this long list of all the amazing things that Odysseus used to have. He says, let me count off for you now what you've got. The irony, of course, is that what he's telling Odysseus is, this is how bad things have gotten. You've only got a dozen herds of cattle left back on the mainland. You got as many head of sheep. You got droves of pigs and goat folks ranging free. You got a few hired hands taking care of it. This is fascinating stuff, and it's dramatic. Odysseus, as an old man, is sitting there, and you can just see him probably starting to seethe, and yet he has to pretend like he is not Odysseus, right? In other words, oh yeah, that's too bad. So tell me again, who is your master? That kind of thing. That's going to be the attitude that he takes, right? Odysseus eats, and at line 129, while the stranger ate his meat, drank his wine, ravenous, bolting it all down in silence, we're told, brooding on ways to serve the suitors right. But once he'd supped and refreshed himself with food, he filled the wooden bowl he'd been drinking from, not a metal bowl. A silver bowl. I mean, we're going to get gifts from Menelaus to Telemachus. I'm sorry, yes, gifts from Menelaus and Helen given to Telemachus in the next book. So one of them is going to be a really beautiful silver drinking cup. Here, notice, because he's poor, it's just a wooden cup, right? Brimmed with wine, and Odysseus passes it to his host, who received the offer gladly, spirit cheered as the stranger probed him now with winging words. Friend, he asks, who is the man who bought you with his goods, the master of such vast riches, powerful as you say? We're going to hear more about Eumaeus' history in the next book. He's going to tell it in more detail. You tell me he died, he's talking about Odysseus, defending Agamemnon's honor. What's his name? I just might know such a man. 2 points here for your notes. 1, Odysseus, as the old beggar, never invents a name for himself. He is quite literally no name, no man. That is to say, what he gave as his name to Polyphemus. Odysseus is in fact that man. He doesn't even give himself a name. But notice here he's asking, what's the name? He wants to hear his own name obviously spoken, right? He says, Zeus might know and the other deathless gods, if ever I saw him, if I bring you any news. I've roamed the whole earth over. And the Eumaeus, the swineherd,